was interested in was, what is it that's driving this dissatisfaction with the political, with democracy in Alberta? And I think the root cause is frustration. Frustration at the lack of change in the political landscape for such a long time. And the fact that we have a governing party that was elected with a minority of the vote and has a huge majority of the seats. Now, of course, there have been recommendations for changing our electoral system, and everybody knows that the first past the post system rewards a party that has a minority of the vote with a huge majority of the seats, and it doesn't reflect voter preferences. And so there have been calls for electoral reform in this province. Now, what would happen if we did have electoral reform in this province? Because most of the recommendations would result in a more accurate reflection of the vote in the legislature. So you would have parties that don't get any seats at the moment in the legislature, and you would have parties, opposition parties, that had a number of seats, you know, to the extent that they deserve it. The result of that would be, I think, a series of minority governments. And I don't know whether the culture in this country, not just this province, would allow for minority governments. If you look at what's happening in Ottawa, what you need in a minority government or a coalition government, where in Europe they function quite well with coalition governments, you need compromise and you need cooperation. But parties in Canada are not used to that. They're not used to coalition governments. And if we have this Westminster style of a parliamentary system, what you have to have is cooperation for a governing party to stay in office. It needs the majority of confidence of the majority of the people in the House. So I think that electoral reform, they have tried it in other provinces. They've had referendums on the question of electoral reform, and they've been defeated. It's too bad. And if you look at what's happening in Ottawa, it seems as if we can't cope. The governing party in Ottawa behaves as if it has a majority government, and because the opposition does not want an election, they go along with whatever the government wants. You know, I mean, even though they know people might not be very happy about it. So, and some of you might know that there's an election going on in Britain, and there is a possibility, and the press is calling this a hung parliament. You know, so this is not a good thing, because one party is not going to get a majority. So this is a foreign concept to people in Westminster-style parliamentary systems. And if we get electoral reform, we'll have to learn to cope with this. But what about informal electoral reform? I think that's what the DRP is looking at. Going over the heads of political parties and, you know, supporting the person in a particular riding that has the best chance of winning. That is informal electoral reform. And if that took place, I think then we might see more opposition members in the legislature. The other question is whether there is a need for new parties. Now, how many parties is ideal, you know? How many parties do you really need in a system? Our system works best with two political parties. Parliamentary system was designed for a governing party and an opposition party. And in 1921, when the Progressives burst onto the political scene, they actually had to change the rules in the House of Commons, because the rules didn't allow for the Speaker only recognized the governing party and the official opposition. So they had to adjust to that. And ever since then, there has been at least one other party beyond the two. So, I mean, they call them all third parties, but I mean, they've been fourth and fifth parties. But what is a magic number for political parties? And to answer that question, you have to ask, what do political parties do? They're supposed to reflect the society that they represent. So you could have big tent parties that include everybody. You can have parties that represent the left and the right of the political spectrum. Or you could have parties that represent divisions in a particular country, religious, ethnic, linguistic, and others. Now, for example, in Holland, they have a sort of fourfold division in their society. And they had parties, a Catholic party, Calvinist party, a Liberal party, Socialist party. And each of these parties represented that narrow, well, it's not very narrow, some of them had about 30% of the vote. They represented those groups. They had interest groups for people of that party, whether they're Catholic, Calvinist, Liberal, Socialist. Their employment was within that. They called them pillars, Säulen in Holland. So these pillars that represented their society had their own little structures, the education system, and so on. And since then, I think things have changed somewhat, because these religious parties, a lot of them now have members who want to get rid of the Islamist influence in Holland. But what happened then was the leaders of these parties would negotiate things on behalf of their membership. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's particularly healthy, but what I'm saying is that parties emerge to reflect the kind of society they live in and the kinds of demands that are put upon them. Now, Alberta has had 13 parties over the years, and this is not counting all the independent Labour, independent Progressive, and so on, people that have run for elections. So, they had things like the Economic Reconstruction Party, the Independent Citizens Association, the Alberta Unity Movement. And a few of us in this room will even remember some of the most recent examples. There's the Alberta Reform Movement, the Western Canada Concept, the Confederation of Regions, the Heritage Party, and on and on. So we've had a number of parties that have come and gone, and nobody remembers them after a few years. And I bring this up because there has been some question about the viability of the Liberal Party and the viability of the Liberal brand. Even members of the Liberal Party have some of them believe that this brand is tainted and the name has to be changed. And of course, the Conservatives have repeatedly said that this is a desert for Liberals. Alberta is a desert for Liberals. Now, this is a very convenient ploy, and it proves the old adage that belief is created by repetition. Because even, as I say, some Liberals believe that. Yet, if you look at the statistics, the Liberals came within 4% of the Conservatives in 1993, and in the last 4 elections have averaged 31% of the vote. Now, that doesn't sound like a tainted brand to me, so I think that there are other reasons why that success might not be there. The Conservatives wandered in the political wilderness for 66 years, and then they won in 1971. Now, of course, there's a new kid on the block, which is the Wild Rose Alliance, and it seems to be poised to mount a strong challenge to the Conservatives. I think they've waged a very skillful campaign to capture headlines, and I think that's mainly because of their leader, Danielle Smith. She's young, she's personable, she's intelligent and articulate. And this is a threat from the right. But that doesn't mean that all the other parties should curl up and die. I think that there is an opportunity now for opposition parties to hammer away, because there's a very weak government, at the weaknesses of this administration. And I think that in the end, there's so much grist for the mill that everybody could benefit from the weakness of the party. Now, I don't want to say anything more because I'm sure that Phil and Avalon have more to say on the topic.